Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled Peer Support, Why Your Recovery Program Needs It. My name is Christine McKenna. I am the director of the Rockingham County Recovery Court in New Hampshire. I'm really pleased to be with you today. Today we're going to be, this webinar is brought to you by the New England Association of Recovery Court Professionals in partnership with the New England Addiction Technology Transfer Center, which is funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. New England Associate of Recovery Court Professionals is a New England consortium of the New England states, and we're really proud to be able to put this information that brings different emerging issues that drug courts are faced with. We address critical and current emerging issues, and we provide some training and technical assistance, like in today's webinar that you see. We bring this information together. We are also providing a central forum and repository of resources relevant to the development, operation, and implementation of teams. Knowledge changes, and so we'd like to be on the forefront to bring it to you. You can also find all the information that we put together in the various webinars on our website. So we're really grateful that we're able to put this together. And what's also going to be adding to our repertoire of information is about our presenter today. Abby Fruchte is a social worker, LADAC. She's a 2006 graduate of the Washington County Adult Treatment Court in Maine. So she has been a consumer of recovery courts. She is a substance use response coordinator for Community Caring Collaborative and has 13 years of experiencing practice as a licensed substance use treatment provider and a clinical supervisor specializing in treatment of those involved in the criminal justice system. She's worked with the Washington County Adult Treatment Court in Maine since 2012 as both a treatment provider and clinical supervisor. In 2020, Abby was appointed as the first treatment court graduate to sit on the NADCP Board of Directors. Abby is the vice chair of the National Treatment Court Alumni Association, which works to increase the efforts to support treatment courts alumni across the county, or excuse me, across the country. I apologize. So a little bit of housekeeping. By now, most of us know how to utilize the Zoom features for webinar controls. We will do questions and answers. Please put your questions in the Q&A portion of the on the Zoom screen, if you will. And chat, don't use the chat feature. We will utilize that to get out some information as you might need that. Additionally, evaluations and CEUs will be presented to you. After this webinar is over, we will send an evaluation link from New England Addiction Technology Transfer Center. And after you complete that evaluation, we will make sure that you have your certificate to download for completion of CEUs. And also after the webinar, and after we received evaluations, we will post the webinar on the New England website. So that's really cool. I don't want to waste a lot of time talking about all kinds of little housekeeping things. We'll throw some things in the chat here and there to help people along. So if you've forgotten some of the stuff that I might have just mentioned, never fear, you'll hear it again. I want to jump right into our presenters today. Abby's got some phenomenal experience and a whole load of information that will be really beneficial. And I'm really excited that we have this topic. This has really been, I think, instrumental in how a lot of drug courts, recovery courts, treatment courts, how they're working now, and really provides our participants with the best sort of resources that are out there. So I'm really excited to hear about what she has to say. Abby, go take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Christine, and just a pleasure to be here. Just my deep appreciation to the New England Association of Recovery Court Professionals and ATTC for asking me to facilitate and present today's training topic. And just a recognition as well that we have a lot of expertise in the room, and I realize that we are webinar style, so we may not be in community or in conversation in a way that we would if we were in a live training session, but there will be times where I'll be asking you to share, to reflect, and just again, an acknowledgement that there's a lot of expertise right here in this very space, from peer support specialists to courts that have fully implemented, to courts that are very interested in implementing the role of peer recovery support specialists. So much knowledge here in the space. Do you want to take an opportunity to highlight what we'll be covering today? And so these are really our goals for today, and hoping that we can all build on existing knowledge that we have. Again, recognizing that there's vast expertise in the space, and today's learning opportunity will just be an addition to that knowledge that you have. So looking at learning the value of peer support, we'll be taking a pretty deep dive. I think if you showed up to this webinar today, then you value peer support. But we'll be diving in a little bit deeper to really recognize what the research tells us. We'll do some personal reflection, really to help us have a deeper understanding of the value of that role as a fundamental component of our teams and integration within our treatment and recovery court program. We'll also be looking at what that role looks like within a court program. I want to recognize that peer recovery support specialist, that role is not new. It's a role that we have utilized for decades within the recovery field, but how does that look integrated into our court program? So we'll be really exploring that today and looking at the guidelines that have been provided to us by leading experts in this work. And I'll highlight and give credit to a few of those national organizations that have just been leading the way in peer support across the country. And lastly, I say myths, will dispel myths, but I often think that it's not necessarily a myth. It might be misknowledge or a lack of knowledge or a misunderstanding about the role of peer support. So we'll be swimming around in that a little bit. I think it's important that we all create space to be in those conversations to help us best understand or gain knowledge about a variety of roles on the team. I do want to acknowledge the field and really acknowledge those that have been bringing forward this work, both recently and longstanding. First and foremost, want to recognize All Rise, and maybe here on this call, we may have individuals that have contributed to this work. And so I recognize that this work by All Rise, the incorporating peer recovery support into treatment courts, the practice guidelines for implementation, was really led by the research and information both by All Rise and the research team and our other peer support organizations, SAMHSA and the National Association of Peer Supporters, but also contributors to those contributions were made by those working in the field. And so I just want to recognize the contributors. This was just released in November. If you've not yet seen it, I would encourage you to go to the All Rise website. It's accessible, available for download, and you can print it. It's not a overly large document, and it's a tool that we're going to be using today as we look at the guidelines that have been brought forth. Also want to recognize SAMHSA and the longstanding work that they have done in the field of their peer roles and their development of core competencies. They recently launched a new publication around peer support in the recovery field. So that was a newly revised publication that was hot off the press. It just came out. And of course, the National Association of Peer Supporters, their national practice guidelines for peer support specialists and supervisors. Again, experts in this field that have been leading the way for a number of years. So just a nod to them. But before we start, it is important that we find out who's in the room. This is going to be valuable to just our experience together today and be helpful to know who's joining us. So what we're going to do, as I recognize people may be eating lunch or you may be transitioning, but if you're able to, I ask that you participate in a poll that we'll be launching. So first, we're going to be asking you the question, what is your role on the team? Do you currently have peer support integrated into your court program? So not just a utilization, but is it integrated into your court program? And lastly, if you said no to number 2, if you said no, we'd like you to answer the additional question, number 3, what is the biggest barrier? And you can select a couple. So we will go ahead and we will launch the poll now. You see it on your screen. 3 questions. What is your role on the team? Do you currently have peer support integrated into your program? And if no, what are the biggest barriers? We'll give you just a moment to answer those. Wonderful. We'll take just a few more seconds if you haven't had a chance. And then once that poll is complete, if we want to launch the poll, we'll go ahead and we'll review the results. Okay, wonderful. Let's see who is in the room. Oh, we've got a shout out to our peer support specialists. I told you we have a lot of expertise in the room. Glad to have you here and glad to have all of you. I see just a variety of roles, critical roles, from judges to treatment providers, case managers, probation, court coordinators. Wonderful to have you all here. And again, an emphasis, wonderful to have our peer support specialists here. You are certainly leading the work, and we're just grateful to have you be part of today's presentation. Wow, this is great to see. Of the responses, we have 37% who have a fully integrated peer support specialist integrated into their court program. So again, expertise in the room. This will be an opportunity to reflect on your current practices. You may share lessons learned. Please use the Q&A if you say, well, this is not how we do it. We're really happy to be in conversation about this work, recognizing that it's a new implementation for many of our courts. And no was 63%. I'm not fully shocked by that because I think many of us are just leaning into this. And we're recognizing some of the barriers that we face, which we're hoping to touch on today. So you may recognize that it's not as big of a barrier, or now I have a resource or some knowledge or understanding about how to overcome that barrier. First and foremost is, where do I start? That is exactly why, and I see Ray dropped it in the chat. Thank you so very much. That's exactly why we're here today, to hopefully really introduce some guidelines and a depth of understanding about this is where we can start. Being here at this training is a wonderful start. Funding, who's gonna pay for the peer support specialist? Really looking at that role. What does that look like? The concerns for some risks that peer integration of peer support may cause to the participant or the peer themselves, and then maybe some other barriers. One of the things I want to highlight that I'm glad to see is support from the team is not a barrier. That is, for anyone that's been working within treatment courts for more than a decade, I think just seeing the transition in really understanding the integration and professionalism of peer support has grown vastly. A decade ago, I don't even know if they'd be examining or in conversation. Certainly, we know the field itself has grown a lot over the past decade. So I'm glad to see that that's not a barrier, nor is lack of guidance to ensure integrity to the program. So that's wonderful. Great, thank you so much for jumping right in, answering those questions. And again, we hope that today's webinar can help to answer some of those for you. I do want to make sure that we highlight a couple of definitions. I do recognize that as we're in shared spaces and we're in the space of peer support, that often many terms are used interchangeably. As a treatment court graduate, as an alumni, as a peer, I sometimes realize that we're not speaking the same language when I'm in conversation with people. And I may mean one thing and they're thinking another. And really what that comes down to is us making sure that when we're in conversation about the peer role, formal, peer recovery support specialist, and we just give a little definition to it. So I want to highlight 4 different terms that I'll be using often today. So first of all, peer support. Peer support is the process of giving and receiving help among people in similar situations based on key principles and includes respect, shared responsibility, and mutual agreement on what is helpful. Peer recovery support specialist. This is an individual who is currently in recovery, who has lived experience with substance use disorder or co-occurring mental health disorder, and has been trained to help their peers with a similar experience to gain hope, explore recovery, and achieve life's goals. Alumni. An alumni is a graduate of a specialty court program, treatment court program, and so an alumni is a graduate. And recovery support services, these are non-clinical services that assist individuals and family in recovery to access or form recovery and to stabilize after substance use disorder. These include social services, linkage to supportive services, really a full range of connection to human services as well. So with that said, I want to take a minute to lead you all through a bit of personal reflection. This picture makes me happy, or these pictures make me happy. I would love for you all just to reflect, do some personal reflecting, and think about a time when you found yourself in a new situation. This may be when you were young, maybe when you started a new sports team, when you joined Scouts, when you joined an athletic club. Maybe it was when you were a teenager or heading off to college, starting a new high school. Maybe it was when you're an adult. You've moved away, you've started a new job, you're trying a new hobby, whatever it may be. I want you to think about you started something new, or you found yourself in a new place or a new situation. And now I want you to think about, who did you gravitate towards in that situation? Maybe it was a single person, maybe it was a group of people, but who did you gravitate towards? And as you think about that, just want you to reflect on, what was it about that person that led me to gravitate towards them? Oftentimes it's someone that we know may show us the ropes, or may have experience in the new job that we've stepped into, or within the agency that we've stepped into. Or maybe they're a senior player on the sports team that we've joined. Maybe they're the newbie. Maybe that's our shared experience, that they're the new person, and we connect with them on that level. Maybe there's someone that was just warm and welcoming, and that was just what you needed, because this new thing was a little scary, it was a little uncomfortable, and there was a lot of unknowns. So as you reflect on that, just want to highlight that this activity really highlights that the concept of peers is not new. For decades and even centuries, we have gravitated towards peers as a means of survival, as a means of growth, as a means of camaraderie. We've always, as a society, gravitated towards peers in a community. Those with similar experiences, those that can teach us, protect us, provide something for us, or keep us safe from something that we want to avoid. The concept of peers is not new. And so here, I'm just highlighting some of the pictures of peers in my life. We have a picture from RISE, the annual national training conference for treatment courts that's held every year. This is a group of treatment court graduates. They're flexing their alumni strong muscles, and we're in community. You'll hear me use that word a lot, community. And I don't necessarily mean the block that you live on. I mean, being in shared space with people that have shared values, shared passions, where you feel safe. That's what I mean when I'm saying community. The picture on the upper right, this is a treatment court team of participants that went out and played some ball. So really looking at engaging in pro-social activities as a group. And the picture on the bottom right is me and a friend summiting the highest mountain in Maine. And it is something that I would never have done if it were not for that relationship, being in community with her, and her reminding me that I can do it and I don't have to do it alone. The concept of peers is not new. It is absolutely not new to the field of substance use, recovery, mental health. We have actually relied on the roles of peers for many reasons in our work in the treatment and recovery court field. As we reflect back, we have always required, it's always been a component of our program for participants to engage in pro-social activities. Why is that? We'll talk a little bit about communities, peers, and relationships a little bit further on. But we've always relied on that. We've always known the value of peers. Did you make it to your meeting? Did you connect with that individual? What was the impact that they had on your life? We've always relied on peers in treatment and recovery courts. We've relied on them because they're often accessible. They're definitely relatable. There might be opportunities for informal interactions, things that other team members can't provide. For example, as a treatment provider, I wasn't necessarily able to transport a participant to a recovery meeting and sit with them and share with them, where a peer could. We know that the role of peers has been invaluable in the treatment and recovery court field, whether that's peers related to recovery, to community, to faith, to culture, to the armed forces, to mental health. We know, and we'll talk a bit more about the impact that our peers have and the role that they have in treatment and recovery courts. So let's talk about the value of relationships. If you're familiar with social capital theory, while there's been many contributions to this concept and to this theory over the years, social capital theory looks at relationships as an asset. So again, before we get into more details about social capital theory, I'm going to have you do another reflection, because I feel as though as we're talking about peers, it's important that we put ourselves in a place where we recognize that peers have been valuable to us. Whether you're a judge or a case manager or a court coordinator, maybe it wasn't a recovery peer, but peers have played a role in your life too. And so in social capital theory, as I said, it highlights that relationships are an asset. So think about a relationship in your life and the value that it added. Maybe that was career growth. Maybe it was personal growth. Started to look at myself differently, think about myself differently, that intrinsic growth. Maybe it was spiritual growth, health and fitness, financial growth. Think about that. And think about what value did that relationship add? Because we know that as a society, relationships and being in community add value to our lives. Again, I go back to they allow us to get something good or avoid something bad. In social capital theory, it really looks at, again, relationships as an asset, and that relationships are what allow individuals to collaborate, to coordinate, to live together. It's important that we're in community. I had touched on really community being that the components of having shared values or norms. When I use the word community, I'm often talking about my social circles. Maybe it's my fitness community or my recovery community. Those aren't new terms because community refers to those shared values. We're part of those communities, those social networks, because we're looking to achieve something or to avoid something. We don't join communities to cause harm or pain. And it's important as we look at and think about our participants and communities that they're coming from, social circles that they're coming from, to also recognize that communities can have negative impacts or engage in negative behavior. As we think about recovery capital, and I'll tie these two together in just a moment, recovery capital is, I'm sure, a very familiar concept to many of you. Recovery capital, the concept of recovery capital has been around for a number of decades now, really brought forward by William White, who's just been a fierce advocate and researcher in our recovery community. And really, it's been gaining traction in the treatment and recovery court field over the last several years, a recognition around the internal and external assets that an individual holds that can help them both initiate recovery and sustain recovery. So I'm going to tie these two together in just a moment. But first of all, I want to go over what recovery capital is in case you're not familiar with it, and also highlight the newly published best practice standards by All Rise, formerly known as the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. In their second edition, newly published second edition, Standard 6 really provides a standard on assessment, implementation, and utilization of complementary services and recovery capital. So again, we see the integration of recovery capital more formally in our field. But there are four primary components to recovery capital that I'll go over briefly. First and foremost is personal. Personal and human recovery capital, this really looks at an individual's basic needs, their health care, financial needs, clothing, food, safe and stable housing. If we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this would be the very base. If an individual doesn't have those immediate needs met around safety and health and self-care in the way of safe housing or health, really recognizing that the ability to initiate or sustain recovery is going to come with a lot of barriers. And I know that we've seen this and we've experienced this both with our participant or maybe in our own lives if we're a person in recovery, just that recognition of when those needs aren't met, initiating recovery can be very difficult as well. Human capital really looks at an individual's abilities around problem solving, that intrinsic, how they're able to look at their own personal self-esteem, the interpersonal skills, how they can handle challenging situations, those sort of skills. Peers, and I'll touch on this, do a phenomenal job mentoring and role modeling in this arena around human capital. Family and social recovery capital. I want to sit in this one for just a moment because this is really where peers play a role. These are the resources connected to intimate family relationships with friends, with relatives, but also with supportive recovery community. And so this really includes access to recovery-related social events, and then moves us into the community recovery capital, which really focuses on access to recovery community centers, for example, or recovery-ready communities, which may extend even further across sectors, including employment, housing, collegiate recovery campuses, and so forth. So peers play a critical role, not only in mentoring and assisting with personal recovery capital, connecting to those resources that an individual may need, modeling those intrinsic characteristics around problem solving or confidence or interpersonal skills. They play a critical role in those connections to recovery supports with peers within the community. The fourth dimension is cultural capital, and really this looks at an individual as it resonates culturally to their community or faith-based beliefs, really looking at if there has been a disconnection from that, if that were a component in their life, or if they would like to explore that further and how we can support them in that. So I want to pull these two together. I've talked about social capital, recovery capital, talked about relationships, which is so extremely valuable. And I'll highlight a piece here in just a moment when we go a little bit further with the recovery capital. But what you can see here is around social recovery capital, the role that it plays when we look at the gears around the connection between social recovery, community recovery capital, and personal recovery capital, and the role that peers play being role model, connections to those social networks, connections to those resources. Again, I go back to when relationships, we're in relationship, they are an asset to us. You personally reflected on the assets and the relationships in your life and the impact those had on you. And so I encourage you, as we're in conversation with our participants, to be thinking about what does that look like for them? So as you leave today's webinar, that's a perfect opportunity to even just start thinking, where's Abby sit in this? What are her relationships looking like? And it can really help us have a deeper understanding of areas that certainly would benefit from some growth, or maybe areas of strength in the participant's life. So we have absolutely established that peers are not only crucial, but they are invaluable to the recovery field. Recovery peers have the ability to offer a level of empathy and understanding that cannot be just learned, but rather lived. So along with what we know, I do want to highlight that there is data out there specific to the impact that peer support has on a number of different components of where it intersects in a person's life. And I want to raise that up because I recognize in the work that we do, depending on your role, I'm often driven by show me the research, show me the data. And so I want to make sure that you see that there is very clear data on the outcomes that peer support has on an individual's life. So SAMHSA has provided us with information around the impact, including the reduction in recurrence of substance use. Also, there's been an improved treatment engagement and retention. When you think about entering, when we go back to that first question, what was that experience like starting something new for the first time? Who did you gravitate towards? Think about the role that the peer plays when a participant is just entering treatment and recovery court for the first time. What helps them stay? What gets their feet planted? And so we know that peers improve treatment engagement and retention. There's also more satisfaction in participation when there's peers involved. And again, this is mental health, substance use as well. The research tells us that there's a reduction in utilization of emergency services and hospitalization, which leads to a variety of wins, as we know, accessing or overutilizing hospitals or emergency departments, and really helping them access primary care or other sustainable healthcare services. And this is important as we look at integration in treatment and recovery courts. The research shows that there's a reduction in new incarceration. So these are all such critical and important components of the research around the impact of peer supports. And there's peer supports on this call. I know you're all kind of nodding your head right now going, I know that. Or there's programs on this call that you're probably saying, yep, I've seen that. I've experienced that. And I know those impacts because I get to see them day in and day out. So while we've talked about informal peer supports on many levels, or we've talked about our own personal experience, I do want to bring it just a bit more granular to look at the role of formal and professional peer supports. That's really what we're looking at today as we look at the integration of those professional peer supports on our team. Peer support encompasses a range of activities and interactions between people who share similar experiences of being diagnosed with mental health conditions, substance use disorders, or both. This connection between a peer support worker and a person in or seeking recovery promotes connection and inspires hope. We absolutely know that. Peer support offers a level of acceptance, understanding, and validation not found in relationships with many other professionals. By sharing their own lived experience and practical guidance, peer support workers help individuals develop their own goals, create strategies for self-empowerment, and take concrete steps towards building and fulfilling self-determined lives for themselves. That passage comes directly from SAMHSA as they talk about who and what peer support is. So let's look at the core values of peer support. I'll take a minute to go through the 12 core values and also just want to highlight any time a question comes my way around something a team is navigating in regards to peer support, or what we're navigating as we're piloting different peer support programs across the state of Maine. I like to look at how does that refer back to the core values. So, for example, the question may be, should I or should we integrate this role into the peer support specialist job description? Let's go back to the core values. How does that sit with the core values? Does that align with the core values? So the core values are brought to us by the National Association of Peer Supporters. I encourage you to use these or consider these as you're looking at or navigating any questions that may come up for your team around peer support. Always going back. Does it align with these core values? So quickly, I'll go through those core values. First and foremost, peer support is voluntary. I think this is something that many of us in treatment and recovery courts have come up against. We've been accustomed to a system that has requirements. And so as we look at peer support and the integration of peer support, it has been interesting to be in conversations with teams just around how they're navigating the autonomy of participants to choose engagement in peer support. Peer supporters are helpful. Core value 3, peer supporters are open-minded. 4, peer supporters are empathetic. 5, peer supporters are respectful. 6, peer supporters facilitate change. 7, peer supporters are honest and direct. 8, peer support is mutual and reciprocal. 9, peer support is equally shared power. This will come up a couple of times during the presentation, and questions that often come up when in conversations with team about the role of peer support specialists, really ensuring often going back to, does this put the peer support specialist in any situation in which there's a power imbalance? The guidelines from All Rise emphasize this as well, ensuring that peer support specialists are not making recommendations, for example, on incentives or sanctions, because that puts them in a position of a power imbalance. So that's just a quick example. Number 10, peer support is strength focused, absolutely. 11, peer support is transparent. And 12, it is person driven, which means that the participant is the one really behind the wheel, and the peer support specialist is the GPS. They're helping to guide, they're helping to put some of those guardrails up. So those are the core values of peer support specialists from the National Association of Peer Supporters. So this right here is where the role gets very specific as I get into some conversation on peer support specialists. Peer support specialists, they can go by a variety of titles depending upon the state, the region, or the certification. I recognize this conference has this webinar has participants from a number possibly of different states in New England. And so recognition that state to state, the certification may go by a different name and have different eligibility or qualifications for certification. So I'll be talking broadly when I speak on this role. But we typically know peer support specialists by a variety of names, including certified peer support specialist, recovery coaches, intentional peer support specialists. And I'm sure, considering we have peer supports on the team, I'm sure that we have there might be other terms or certifications that we know across our states or regions. But for today's training, I will be often referring to certified peer support specialist or peer recovery support specialist. That aligns with the terminology that's used in the publication by All Rise. The eligibility to become certified as a peer, that also varies state to state, but typically it requires a minimum amount of time in recovery. Typically is 1 to 2 years, depending upon the state certification. There is a need to pass a criminal background check. I often, when I talk to people about this, they say, what do you mean? Of course there's going to be legal involvement. I'm a graduate from the Treatment and Recovery Court, or I've navigated the justice system. That's why I'm in this role. What this means is every state licensing or credentialing board has a process in which they review and examine criminal history. It does not mean it's a disqualifier. So I like to hold that up because sometimes I know peers, it can be a little intimidating or discouraging for an individual that's pursuing this as a professional certification. I will say, however, it is valuable to know what your state certification eligibility is, because if you are working with someone or know someone that is interested in pursuing certification as a career pathway, just knowing, will there be disqualifiers, or is there a period of time needed between their legal involvement and their certification? Again, this can vary state to state. States require a certain number of course hours or education and engagement in a certification exam. The course hours, that can also vary state to state. Typically, it's anywhere from 20 hours to 100 hours of approved education, and it covers the topic of peer supports, communication skills, ethics and boundaries, cultural competency may be included in that, or trauma-informed care, and of course, a focus on substance use and mental health. Certifications are typically required to be renewed either annually or every 2 years, and require continuing education that is outlined by the certifying body. So with this, the reason why it's important to share this with you is, this is going to help break one of those myths that this is a professional role. There's training, there's certification, there's oversights and credentialing state bodies. This is a professional role that, as we talk about our certified peer recovery specialists on the team. The role of a certified peer recovery specialist really will encompass many of the things that I've outlined here. And I encourage, again, to go back and look at how this aligns with the values. As you're thinking about the role of the peer, look at the values. Well, how does this align? And how are we working with the organization that employs the peer to be in conversation about the role? And we'll touch on the body that the organization that may employ the peer, and how that fits into the team, and how we're in conversation with them to develop this role. But typically the role of the peer will be to provide those non-clinical strengths-based supports, both formal and informal. What we mean by formal, that is scheduling a meeting, setting goals, attending court with the peer, or with the participant, excuse me. Informal might be when you get a call that says, I need to have a coffee and a talk. I'd love a ride to a meeting. And the certified peer can do that. They have the ability to do that because that is part of the work that they do, which again can look vastly different than what, for example, a treatment provider can do. We've already touched on it. They absolutely mentor those pro-social skills. Problem solving. I reflect back on some of those skills that we can often take for granted. For example, paying a bill, being in conversation with a bill collector, scheduling a medical appointment, going to a parent-teacher conference for our kiddo. All of these experiences for our participants as they enter the Treatment and Recovery Court program are new experiences, because they're doing them likely for the first time in recovery. And so a peer has that ability to mentor those skills, how to advocate for themselves, how to call and schedule a medical appointment, how to be in conversations that might be a little bit tricky or tough, or I feel defeated or discouraged. They do a phenomenal job mentoring those pro-social skills. We know that peers absolutely inspire hope and recovery, and there's a connection to those resources and services and help our participants really develop goals that the participant has identified that they want for themselves. They help support and create self-empowerment, and again, going back to those advocacy skills. So really looking at the role of the certified peer recovery specialist is helping our participants literally grow. A little nod to the picture that we have here. But this is so important to keep in mind. When I was creating this slide, I have to say, I could hear Doug Marlowe, I can hear Helen Herbert saying, stay in your lane. And we recognize that in treatment courts, sometimes those lanes can look like a 10-way highway. It's like being in LA. Can sometimes be very overwhelming. And it can appear easy for us to just veer off out of our lane or to ask someone to do something because it may be helpful to us or I'm not available. It's so important, though, for all of our roles, but for today's purposes, for the role of the peer, to ensure that we're not, as a team, ever putting them in a situation in which they're veering into another lane, or as they're settling into the role, that we're helping them recognize when they might be inadvertently veering into a lane, because unintentionally, there's risk of causing harm. Some of the best examples that I can give is thinking about if we ask a peer support to verify attendance somewhere. I'll share a brief little story. This was many years ago, and certainly so many advancements in our court systems and our treatment court systems now. But I was in a court session where a peer was asked to verify in open court if a participant was at a anonymous recovery meeting. And for so many reasons, that just was not appropriate. And at the time, we just recognized that this was putting the peer at risk for having that power differential, also putting them at risk for breaking anonymity, and it was putting at risk the participants' feeling of safety to attend those meetings. And so with a pause, the question was not answered and it was retracted, which was a great learning experience for the team. But in that moment, it was asked. And so just thinking about how we can sometimes, we're not asking the peer support specialist to be a compliance officer. Was the participant home at curfew? Did they go to the meeting? We're not putting them in a situation to create those power differentials. We're certainly not putting them in any situation where they might be observing urines because someone else is not available to be there. Again, just not appropriate power differentials, and it puts at risk the integrity of our program and also can cause harm to the role of the peer support specialist and to the participant. So let's get into the considerations for the team. This next section has 5 considerations that we're going to review. These 5 guidelines are provided to us by All Rise on the implementation of peers. So I'm going to quickly go through them, and you do have access to these as well on the document that Ray had shared in the chat. So first and foremost, we want to make sure that when we're integrating a peer recovery specialist onto our team, that our team has training before the individual joins the team or before the role is fully implemented. We want to make sure that all of the team members, so I am excited today to see just such a variety of team members, that they have training on the understanding of what peer support is, what their role is, considerations for the parameters around that role, really looking at the benefits of peer support and how that role is different from other roles on the team, including alumni. And I do want to take a moment to highlight this. As a treatment court graduate myself, as the vice chair of the National Treatment Court Alumni Association, we are so we're so grateful to have so many treatment court graduates that have moved into professional peer support roles. We also have many treatment court graduates that provide informal, ongoing, valuable support. And so that is just an understanding of the professional role and the valuable, but albeit informal role of an alumni. So it may look different, or it may be one in the same, meaning the graduate has now pursued their professional certification. And so the team just understanding that is so important. Guideline number 2. It's so valuable to clearly define the role of the peer and ensuring, I keep going back to that, but ensuring that that role aligns with the core values of peer support. Peer recovery support specialists should avoid roles, as I've said, that create real or perceived power imbalances. And so working closely with the organization that employs the peer support specialist. During surveying that was done in 2022, I believe, that was conducted in preparation for the guidelines that were provided. What we saw, the results showed, is that a majority of organizations that oversaw the employment of the peer support specialists were the treatment organizations or recovery community centers or public health organizations that hired and supervised other peers. So primarily, those were the organizations who were the employer of the peer support specialist, and then their specific role was to be a member and work closely with the treatment and recovery court team. So when planning the role, work closely with the agency, particularly if they haven't had experience with treatment and recovery courts, so they have a wealth of understanding about multidisciplinary teams and the expectations of participants within the treatment and recovery courts. This may be a new arena for them as well. One question that often comes up as well is really around the consideration of the peer support specialists attending pre-staffing meetings. And I wish we were in shared space because I would call on some of you I'd love to hear your experience if you attend pre-staffing meetings or if you know, what that experience looks like, if you've considered it, if you've tried it, what that experience has been. But what I will say is that it's important that the team just weigh the pros and cons. There's not a do it or don't do it, but it is, again, going back to looking at the value that the peer support brings through their experience and how that can help inform team members, but also recognition that the peer support specialist may be exposed to information that the peer didn't choose to share with them. That takes us back to our core values as we look at the core values and really that it is person driven. And if the participant did not choose to share that with the peer support specialist, and now the peer support specialist is hearing it, it just may be a mismatch. So it's just something, again, for teams to consider and be in discussion about. In Maine, as we're piloting the integration of peer support specialists into courts and into family treatment courts, what we've been doing is having a supervisor, peer support supervisor, attend the staffing meetings, really bring forward that voice of lived experience, and then be there more as an observer versus offering any input, certainly on incentives or sanctions. Again, that really leads to a power differential. But recognizing that across states, they've been looking at different methods of integrating peer supports on the teams. It's also important to consider a caseload depending on your court size and the phase that participants are in. How many of cases should a peer support specialist be carrying to meet the needs of participants? Number 3, so during the planning stage and implementing peers into treatment and recovery courts, again, really looking at who is going to employ that peer support specialist and then working with them on the process of recruiting, hiring, and orienting peer support specialists to the treatment court team. So this is about establishing the relationship with the agency. Again, it may be the treatment agency, it may be a local public health agency or recovery community center. Often MOUs are put into place. to really have a depth of understanding around the role. And again, supervision, and we'll touch a little bit more deeper on supervision on the next slide. Supervision is required per the state certification, and that's delivered by the, typically delivered by the employer of the peer support specialist. They'll be overseeing, and when we talk about supervision, we mean supervision administratively, as well as for support and education. That also includes ongoing training as well. A thoughtful and thorough orientation process that will just give us the best results always, allowing not only a new role, but a new member to the team. It's not only an orientation for the peer recovery support specialist, it's also an orientation for a team that maybe hasn't had this role at the table just yet. Number 4 is that the treatment court ensures that there's ongoing supervision for the peer support specialist. So there's 3 different levels of supervision that are so critical for this role. One is administratively, ensuring documentation, confidentiality of documentation is conducted per the standards of the certification and of the agency. Educational, this is so valuable. We want to make sure that all of our treatment team staff are receiving ongoing continuing education, particularly with this field and with this population. And so ensuring support and supervision around that, and also for certification reasons, there is a required number of continued education hours. Lastly, number 3, this one is so extremely valuable because this is the supportive supervision. So supportive supervision, it really focuses on morale, job satisfaction, but more so reactions to the work. And it helps promote self-care practices. All of us benefit. This is my opinion. All of us benefit from being in spaces with peers or with supervisors to engage in supervision, particularly reactions to the work. We're working with populations in which we're hearing stories. We're walking through really difficult times with them. We may lose them. And ensuring that the peer support specialist has that supervision in place so that they have a safe space that they can navigate their reactions to the work, problem solve, have reactions to an intervention, for example. It's so very important. Lastly, guideline number 5 is that peer support specialists, they receive annual ethics training and training around policies and procedures that be put in place to ensure ethical practices around confidentiality, boundaries, and dual relationships. I like this one because, as Christine introduced me, you guys know I come to this work with a number of different hats. And so I'll just share with you quickly my substance use. I grew up in the community that I live in. I live in the easternmost county in Maine. I feel like at the edge of the earth. And here is where my substance use disorder ran rampant. It's here where my engagement in criminal behavior happened. It's here where my recovery began. It's here where my family was born and grew. It's here where my professional role took off. And it's here where I've continued to be part of the recovery community and also be a professional working in the field. Wow, that's a lot of hats. Well, we recognize that this isn't unique, particularly as I'm talking to a group of New England practitioners. We live in rural communities. We may be in communities where we're in a lot of relationship and a lot of community with individuals. And so I say that to ensure that we're creating space. We're also providing training. We're in conversation, because sometimes it can be difficult to recognize when a dual relationship is moved past the role of a peer support specialist and now is moved into a place which could be a boundary violation, could cause harm to myself or to the participant. And so having that space and that training to ensure ongoing conversations around this are so extremely important. I also think about our peer support specialists that are supporting their own recovery. We too are engaging in whatever those practices may look like. For some of us, it may be showing up to a medical provider's office to receive our own treatment. It may be attending a peer support meeting. It may be attending recovery community events. We'll be in shared space as well with our peers. And so having those conversations around what that looks like and us just being aware of what that role looks like is so extremely valuable. And it looks different for peer support specialists than, again, a clinician, for example, or a judge that may be a person in recovery. It all looks a little bit different. So why is peer support so valuable? I'm going to tell you a short story. And it's about a young lady that entered treatment and recovery court after a decade of substance use at the young age of 22. So her substance use started very early. And she entered treatment and recovery court following a situation in which she was faced with potentially multiple years of incarceration. And she also had an 11-month-old son. This was a new experience for her, being involved in the criminal legal system. Certainly entering a recovery community was new experience for her. But she knew that she wanted to achieve just a life of recovery that was different from the life that she had led. This young lady navigated the early months of treatment and recovery court like a fish out of water. Many of the events that occurred potentially may have had her discharged from the program, but she continued to have the tenacity to want to stay in her recovery process. And then one day a peer entered into her life. And when that peer entered into her life, it was the first time that she had felt in community outside of the community of her substance use and with others engaged in substance use. And it was the first time that she felt in community with someone who fully understood her. I'll share just some quick examples of things that were an experience during her early life that others may not have understood, like vacuuming the living room floor or going to the grocery store, all common practices that we would engage in and not necessarily think twice of. You just do it. Well, for someone, again, entering recovery, all of these are a first, and they can be very scary when you're doing it for the first time, not impaired by drugs or alcohol. And so this peer extended her hand and said, I know that you're scared, and I also know you don't have to do it alone. And that was a pivotal point in this young lady's life. From then on, even during the hard times, the peer would say, just do what I do, and it will be okay. And you never have to do it alone. And that connected that young lady to a community that she didn't even know existed. She had no idea that community existed. And that peer became family. That peer continued to be there in the way, through care and compassion, that young lady needed. And I share that because I'm that young lady, and that peer that entered my life transformed me. And I can genuinely say I wouldn't be standing here before you today as a professional, certainly not as a presenter, talking to you about the topic of peer support if peer support didn't transform my life. My story is not unique, though. We hear these stories every day. The impact that relationships have on the lives of the individuals that are entering our programs. It is just absolutely invaluable. But there's often things that may pause us, and we may say, we don't know if we're ready to implement peer support into our program. We know how good it is. We know how valuable it is. We've been utilizing it through other forms by sending our participants into the community, but we're not sure if we're ready to integrate it. So I want to make sure that this misinformation is not keeping us from moving forward with these opportunities. So throughout the last 75 minutes or so, we've really highlighted the vital role that peers play in recovery and the asset that they can bring to our teams. But sometimes we can still be stuck in the unknown. So I'm sure you've either heard some of these thoughts shared by other team members, maybe you've thought them yourself or said them yourself. Often they may come from a place of protection for the peer, for the participant, for the program. And it is important that we create space for these type of conversations to ensure that our team members' ambivalence isn't overlooked. We want to ensure that we're responding to it and that we're in the conversations around it. So when we go into the work with shared knowledge, shared value, and shared goals, the outcomes can be absolutely amazing. This goes with implementing a new role as well. So some of that misinformation that we may hear, and actually it came up on the screen earlier today, were things around, I'm just afraid it might be too much for my peer support specialist. Maybe it was a former participant and I'm worried at the stress that the job can have on them because I've worked in the court system for a number of years. Or maybe I'm concerned that they'll be triggered by stories and experiences of other participants and it puts them at risk of recurrence. Sometimes, and I hope we're seeing this less and less, maybe there's team members or there's teams that don't see it as a professional role. They see it as a continued informal role. Or maybe there's concern for boundary violations. I'm just not sure how I would handle that or what the relationships would look like. Again, oftentimes this comes from misinformation. And I hope that throughout our time today, as we've gone over the research, the data, we've gone over the guidelines, we've gone over the core values, you've heard some personal stories, you've done some of your own reflecting. I hope that that's provided you information in a way that may dispel any of those thoughts that you had around implementing a peer support specialist. We know that peer support specialists are trained, certified professionals. So exciting to have peer professionals in our field and on our teams. Wow, like how fortunate are we to have that? We also know that employment and being able to pursue a career pathway or move into a professional role, it can be so therapeutic and healing. I say this from a person that started as a treatment core graduate and has moved through a professional career pathway. How rewarding that has been. You'll hear many of those stories as you talk to certified peer specialists. We also know that it can help us have a deep understanding of the population that we serve. There's so much value that peer support specialists bring to this work that we don't find in a textbook, that our participants either aren't able to share or don't know how to share. And I always love it when a peer support specialist says to me, I've got my former participant hat on and I need to let you know that doesn't feel good when this is the process, or that experience can be really tough and tricky for someone new in their recovery. So I just love when they can share that and give me insight. We know that self-care is critical for all professionals working in the field. So there's a recognition that our peer support specialists are likely not the only people on our team that may be a person in recovery. And so as we have fear that there's risk of recurrence of use for them, have we compartmentalized that just to that role? Again, recognizing that any of our team members, any of our staff may have or be a person in recovery or experience the impacts of problematic substance use. We all need outlets for self-care. And maybe we help the peer support specialist really understand what that outlet is for them. How do they take care of them? How do they set healthy boundaries for them so that their recovery is still the number one priority in regards to the recovery they support? And I talked about this. Peers wear many hats. So ensuring that practice of supervision is in place is so extremely valuable because that allows for for not just a dialogue of cases, but also teaching opportunities by the supervisor. It provides opportunities for questions to be asked to the peer support specialist around maybe their feelings of that experience, or how do they view that experience, or how do they see that interaction. And it can really be an amazing space for the peer support specialist to learn, for the supervisor to ensure their safety and protection in regards to boundaries, confidentiality, and ethical practices. And so just a critical part. So knowing this, I hope that dispels all of that misinformation or those myths that we may have really experienced or felt or thought ourselves that have kept us from integrating peer support into our teams. One of the questions I like to ask is, what's at risk if we don't? So I know we have talked about and I've emphasized the value of peer support, but I'd like to turn the table a little bit, and I'd love for you to consider what is at risk if we don't. What is at risk if we don't implement or integrate peer support into our program? So we are really at a pivotal cross-section in the justice system, and a time in which we can bridge even more so to the therapeutic and healing natures of recovery in our peers, relationships, and communities. We are at that turning point. Recovery does not just happen in courtrooms, it happens in communities. And treatment courts are the bridge to the resources and connections in those communities. And I truly believe that peers and alumni, they are the lights that illuminate that bridge. Not bringing professional peers into our program, it can continue to perpetuate that divide where only informal peer support is of value, and being on the team, there's not a place on the team for them. And so as we look at that cross-section, right, looking at this picture, we're really at a cross-section where there's an opportunity. We have guidelines, we have guidance, we have courts that have engaged in this practice for a number of years very successfully. We have peers and peer support specialists that can share with us openly the impact that this work has had on them and on the outcomes for participants. We know it works. We know it works. And so as we wrap up and we move into some questions, I really want to leave you with that. What's at risk if we don't? And ponder on that. Be in conversation with your team on that. Think about that. And really look at, what are we willing to risk as a team if we don't integrate? We're at the end of our presentation. I've been delighted to be able to share this information with you. And again, we just recognize there's so much expertise on the screen. And I know that there's a number of questions that have likely been dropped in the chat. So I would love to be able to answer some of those questions or refer the individual to refer you to any of the documentation that we have here. So it looks like in the Q&A, we have, how would you transition a current team case manager that has requested to also become a certified peer? I guess there's a couple of questions that I would ask around that. Are they looking to transition their role? If so, really looking at what would that look like if there were a dual role, and the risks that could cause? We recognize the role of a case manager and a role of a peer support specialist can look vastly different. And so if the question is, can the case manager also be a certified peer support specialist and act in that capacity in the court? There would have to have a depth of review by the team to see, how do those roles collide? That's similar to, for example, me wearing a clinical hat and then me also wearing a professional peer support hat. We often see that those roles may have vast differences in the delivery of the services or compliance. And so for that, I would say you would really want to examine the risks that that could cause, not only to the delivery of services, but also to the individual that wants to move into that role. What hat do you have on today? Peer support specialists, their work is to not inform the team. A case manager, their role is to inform the team. And what I mean by that is very specific details of the individual's life. It really, to me, there's not an alignment of roles. And actually, there's potential risk that could be caused by that. So I hope that answers that question. And again, a great case, kind of a case to review and study to say, what would this look like and how do these two roles differ so significantly?
Wonderful. This has been wonderful, Abby. You've provided us with some really essential information regarding this really important topic. I'm so glad to see that you, as well as the leadership through All Rise, is really finding that this is its time, if you will, that we bring it forward into our recovery courts, and having such professionals such as yourself bringing this out. And I'm really thrilled to see this, and it's been a tremendous amount of information. I can't wait to. I have peer recovery support in my court, and I know most of us do in New Hampshire, but I can't wait to even round it out, especially with those new guidelines, especially. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. I just put out last call for questions if anybody has anything. We have a few more minutes for Abby, so please put your questions in there if you would like to. I gave you some information regarding the certificate and the evaluation process. I stuck that in the chat as well. Attendees who registered and attend will receive an email within the next 24 to 48 hours with the evaluation link and the CEUs from NADAC as well. And we'll also have a recording on our nearcp.org website of this presentation. So I always love that when we have those, go to the nearcp.org website, because you'll find different presentations there. We get quality presenters, as you can see right here with Abby, and there's so much information. I love to re-listen to these, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, she meant this and that. Oh yeah, I got to put this into my court, et cetera, et cetera. So really grateful that we have you, and a great way to kick off 2024 for our webinar season, if you will. And we put into the chat the nearcp.org website link for those who might be interested in that as well. No, let me see. Do I have another question here? Oh, I got a comment. Thank you. Okay, excellent. Wonderful. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for creating this opportunity for me to share. And thank you to the peer support specialists and for the teams that are embracing this work and showing up here today to say, I want to learn more because we want to move into implementation. Just thank you to the field. Thank you to your commitment to all of the community members that are accessing and utilizing the resources and services. I'm just grateful to be a small part of that. So appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Abby. Well done. Thank you. Thank you.